The flour hit the floor like a confession, white and spreading and impossible to take back. And Della Flynn stood in the doorway of the bunkhouse kitchen staring at the man on his knees scrambling to collect it with his bare hands. And she could not breathe, not because of the mess. Not because he had broken into the ranch kitchen at 4 in the morning with lamplight trembling on the walls and the whole Nevada sky pressing down dark and starless outside. She could not breathe because she recognized the recipe card in his shirt pocket. It was hers. It was her mother's handwriting on that card. The loops of the letters, the slight smear of ink at the corner where her mother had rested her wrist before the ink dried, the way the measurements were written in fractions that only made sense to someone who had baked that bread 100 times. She had thought that card was lost. She had thought everything connected to her mother was buried under 6 feet of dry Nevada earth with the woman herself. Declan Farrow looked up from the floor and met her eyes, and there was no performance in his face, no clever excuse forming behind those dark eyes. There was only the raw, stripped look of a man who has been caught doing something that cost him more than he ever planned to give. "You were making her bread," Della said, and her voice came out wrong, too soft, the kind of soft that happens just before something breaks wide open. "I was trying to," he said. He held the torn edge of the flour sack and he did not stand up. He stayed on his knees on the kitchen floor like a man awaiting sentencing. "I have been trying for 3 weeks. I cannot get the crust right. 3 weeks. Della pressed her hand flat against the door frame because the world had tilted slightly. 3 weeks ago was the last time she had smiled. She had not realized anyone had been counting. She had not realized anyone had been watching her close enough to know that. The night was very still. The flour settled. And somewhere in the distance, a coyote called out once and went quiet, as if even the wild things knew this moment required silence. To understand how a rancher who barely spoke more than 10 words a day, who had buried his heart so deep in the Nevada soil, it had practically taken root there, ended up on his knees on a kitchen floor at 4 in the morning with a dead woman's recipe card in his pocket and flour on his hands. You have to go back 6 months. You have to go back to the morning Della Flynn rode onto the Farrow ranch with nothing but a saddlebag, a broken lease, and the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from surviving things that were supposed to destroy you. The year was 1882, and the high desert of northern Nevada was not a place that welcomed weakness. The sage flats stretched out in every direction under a sky so enormous and indifferent it felt almost punishing, and the ranches that had survived out here had done so through a combination of stubbornness, cattle sense, and a willingness to outlast whatever came. Drought, debt, rustlers, the slow grinding uncertainty of markets that rose and fell on the other side of the continent with no regard for the men and women who had staked their lives on the land. Declan Farrow had been running the ranch alone for 2 years by the time Della arrived. He was 31 years old, broad through the shoulders from a lifetime of physical work, with the kind of quiet that people sometimes mistook for coldness, when it was actually something more like grief wearing a practical disguise. His father had built the Farrow Ranch from nothing in the late 1860s, had pushed cattle up from Texas along routes that were already becoming legend, and had died of a fever in the winter of 1880, leaving Declan the deed, the debt, 4 reliable ranch hands, and a property that required twice as many people to run properly. He had been getting by, not prospering. Getting by. The thing about getting by is that it has a way of becoming a habit so thorough you stop noticing what it costs. Della Flynn came to the Farrow Ranch because she had heard through a chain of women's network that operated quietly and efficiently across the Nevada territory that Declan Farrow needed a cook and a housekeeper, and was too stubborn or too private to advertise for one in any official capacity. She had heard this from Martha Gibbs at the general store in Elko, who had heard it from her cousin's wife in Battle Mountain, and the information had arrived at exactly the moment Della needed a reason to go somewhere that was not where she currently was. She was 27 years old. She had spent the last 4 years on her own small homestead claim, 40 acres of optimistic land that had turned out to be far more alkali than she had been led to believe. And she had worked it until her hands were permanently stained, and her savings were gone, and the lease on the water rights she depended on had been bought by a cattle operation to the north, and simply not renewed. She had not been deceived in any dramatic way. She had simply been made irrelevant by economics, which was its own particular kind of betrayal. She arrived at the Faro Ranch gate on a Tuesday morning in early April with the sage just beginning to bloom and the air still carrying the bite of winter's departure. She rode a good bay mare she had raised herself and had absolutely no intention of selling, regardless of what circumstances required. Some things you did not trade away. Declan was mending fence on the north pasture when one of his hands, a weathered man named Price, who communicated primarily in nods, came to tell him a woman had arrived at the main gate asking about the housekeeping position. Declan looked up from the fence wire. "I did not advertise a housekeeping position," he said. Price nodded in a way that acknowledged this fact without resolving anything. Declan rode back to the main gate. He had been expecting something. He was not sure what. Someone older, perhaps. Someone with the careful, self-contained look of a woman who had organized her life into very practical categories. What he found instead was a woman sitting straight on a bay horse with dust on her coat and clear, direct eyes the color of creek water over dark stone. And she looked at him with an expression that was not desperate and not pleading and not performing any kind of softness to make herself more hireable. She looked at him like she was evaluating whether this arrangement would suit her as much as whether it would suit him. That was the first thing that surprised him. "I understand you need reliable help with the house and cooking," she said, without preamble. "I can cook well, keep accounts, and I know cattle. I am not looking for charity. I am looking for fair wages and fair work." "Who told you I needed help?" he asked. "A chain of women who pay attention to things," she said, "which is most women." He had almost smiled. He had not. But the impulse had been there, surprising and brief. He hired her. She moved into the small room off the kitchen that had been used primarily for storage, and she organized it with the efficiency of someone long accustomed to making do with the space available. She brought very little with her. The saddlebag, a small wooden box that she kept locked, a bundle of books tied together with leather cord, and a flour sack that contained, as far as anyone could tell, nothing but a collection of recipe cards written in 2 different hands. Declan learned within the first week that he had hired someone who was genuinely excellent at several things, and who had very little interest in discussing her personal history. She cooked with a confidence that transformed the bunkhouse kitchen from a place of functional sustenance into something that made his hands want to linger at the table longer than they had any practical reason to. She kept the accounts with a precision that revealed 2 places where his previous informal bookkeeping had been costing him money he couldn't afford to lose. She could look at a cow in the north pasture and correctly identify the early signs of trouble that none of his hands had noticed. She also had a dark past that she wore like a second coat, fitted and unremarked upon, present in every room she entered, he noticed. He was the kind of quiet that notices things, but he did not ask, because he had his own second coat and he understood the etiquette of that. What he did not expect was that working alongside someone, sharing the physical rhythms of ranch life, The early mornings and the late evening accounting by lamplight and the practical conversations about water and cattle and the thousand small crises of land management would begin to do something to the loneliness he had been carrying for 2 years. He did not expect it to matter. He had arranged his interior life very carefully around the understanding that certain things were no longer available to him, and he had gotten quite good at not reaching for them. Della Flynn complicated that arrangement without ever appearing to try. The bread appeared 3 weeks into her time on the ranch. It was a Saturday morning, and Della had risen before dawn as she usually did, moving through the kitchen with the particular quiet competence of someone who has learned to occupy space without imposing on it. Declan was already up, as he usually was, sitting at the end of the long kitchen table with the week's supply ledger open in front of him and a cup of coffee going cold at his elbow because he kept forgetting it was there. He heard her open the recipe box, heard the sound of her going still. He looked up. She was standing at the kitchen counter with a recipe card in her hand, and her whole body had a quality he had not seen in her before. Something soft had come into her posture, something that had nothing to do with sadness exactly but was definitely adjacent to it, the way you stand when you have unexpectedly touched something you loved and lost. "You all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said without turning around. "I am going to make bread." He went back to his ledger. An hour later, the kitchen filled with a smell so specific and particular and full of memory that he actually looked up from his work again. He was not sure what he had expected. Bread was bread. But this was something layered, something that carried weight, the sweetness of the honey she had worked into the dough, the warm mineral undertone of the particular kind of wheat flour, a hint of something herbal that he could not name, and underneath all of it a warmth so fundamental it was almost impossible to describe as merely physical. Della pulled the loaf from the oven and she stood looking at it on the counter, and for a moment, for just that one moment, she smiled. Not at him, not at anything present in the room. She smiled at something the smell had brought back, something completely interior and entirely her own. It was the most unguarded thing he had ever seen another person do. It lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Declan Farrow felt it like a change in weather. He looked back down at his ledger. He wrote nothing for several minutes. The words on the page were there, and he could see them, and they meant nothing at all. He did not understand right away what had happened. He was not a man given to immediate emotional analysis. What he understood was that something had shifted, and that the shift had the quality of something that could not be shifted back. The bread was extraordinary. The hands ate it at lunch and said nothing because they were range hands who were not in the habit of offering culinary commentary, but they ate every crumb. And Price, who communicated exclusively in nods, nodded twice. Della did not make it again for several weeks. Declan found himself, in the following days, thinking about those 4 seconds with a frequency that he recognized as significant and found mildly alarming. He was not a man who allowed himself to dwell. Dwelling was a luxury that the work of running a ranch alone did not accommodate, and he had trained himself efficiently against it over the 2 years since his father's death. But this was different. This was not dwelling. This was something more like having acquired a new fixed point of reference that kept appearing on his mental horizon, regardless of where he tried to point himself. He thought about why that particular smile had undone him in a way that all the practical daily proximity of working alongside her had not. He thought about it while riding fence, and while checking the water levels on the east tanks, and while doing the 1,000 mundane physical tasks that ranch life required of his body, while his mind went where it pleased. He arrived eventually at the conclusion that it was because it was entirely hers. Everything else about Della Flynn's face during working hours was legible and purposeful, shaped for a world that required her to be competent and direct and unsentimental. That smile had belonged to no one and nothing external. It had belonged entirely to the interior life she carried behind those creek water eyes, the life she shared with no one, the life she had presumably been surviving on alone for years. He wanted, with a specificity that startled him, to see it again. He was aware, having thought it clearly, that this was the most dangerous kind of wanting. Not the wanting of something you can pursue directly and acquire through effort or negotiation, but the wanting of something that can only happen on its own terms, something you can only prepare the ground for, and then wait. He also understood that he was lonely in a way that had become structural, built into the architecture of his days, and that recognizing it clearly was not the same as being able to do anything about it quickly. He did nothing. He did nothing except be present and reliable and useful in all the practical ways that the ranch required. And he let the days accumulate. And he learned things about her that she told him without telling him, the way people do. He learned that she had grown up somewhere in Missouri, had come west with a husband she did not speak of, and that the husband was not a living concern. He learned this not from anything she said directly, but from the way she handled certain kinds of silences and the particular care with which she had arranged her small room and the locked box that sat on the shelf above her cot. He did not know if the husband had died or departed or become some other category of loss, and he did not ask. He respected the architecture of her privacy because he had his own. He learned that she read anything she could get her hands on, that she had strong opinions about water rights and land policy, that she was genuinely kind to the horses in a way that was not performative, and that she had some formal education beyond what was typical, something in the way she approached accounting and the careful way she chose her words in conversation. He learned that she cried once, alone in the kitchen late at night, about a week after she arrived when she thought everyone was asleep. He had gotten up for water and heard her through the door. He had stood very still in the hallway for a moment, and then gone back to his room without the water, and he had never referred to it and never intended to. He learned that she had a laugh she had apparently misplaced somewhere and was still looking for. The ranch had good days and hard days that spring. There was a stretch in May when 3 cows turned up dead near the dry creek bed on the eastern boundary, and the cause was unclear enough to be worrying. Declan and his hands spent 3 days investigating before they identified a patch of locowweed that had pushed up through the alkali crust in an area where the cattle didn't usually graze. They cleared it and moved the herd and lost no more cattle, but those 3 days had the particular tension of a problem where you don't yet know the shape of what you're dealing with. And Della had been present through all of it, keeping the accounts of what was lost, helping in the practical ways available to her, and never once introducing any kind of panic into the atmosphere. He noticed that too. In June, a rider came from town with a letter from a land company operating out of San Francisco that had recently acquired several large water claims in the northern part of the county. The letter was politely worded and therefore more threatening than an aggressive one would have been. It expressed interest in discussing a possible purchase of the Faro water rights on the South Range. Declan read the letter twice and set it on the table and looked at it for a long time. Della came into the kitchen, saw his face, saw the letter, and sat down across from him. "What does it say?" she asked. He told her. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do not sell. If you sell the South Range water rights, you lose your winter grazing, and without winter grazing, you cannot maintain the herd size that makes this operation viable." The letter is polite because they expect you to be economically pressured enough to accept a modest offer rather than hold on. If you can hold on, you should. He looked at her. You know land-water law. I had 40 acres in Lander County, she said, with a flatness that told him everything about how that had ended. I know it now. He did not sell the water rights. Over the following weeks, she helped him draft a response that was courteous and complete and definitively closed the subject. The land company sent one follow-up letter that was slightly less polite, and then went quiet, redirecting their acquisitions elsewhere. Declan noted this with satisfaction that was mixed with something else, the particular pleasure of standing shoulder to shoulder with someone in a difficult position, and finding that the other person's shoulder was reliable. That pleasure was not simple. He was becoming very aware that it was not simple. July came with heat that turned the sage silver and pressed the sky down to a white haze, and the ranch settled into the particular rhythm of high summer where the work was relentless, and the evenings, when they came, had the quality of something almost sacred. The hands sat on the bunkhouse porch after supper with the day's heat finally releasing from the ground, and the first stars appearing, and nobody said much, which was fine because the quiet had a texture to it that was companionable. Della took to walking in the evenings. Not far, just out past the barn to where the sage opened up, and you could see the whole western sky going through its long summer performance. Declan started walking that direction too, on no particular schedule, with no arrangement between them. But somehow they ended up walking together more often than not, and the conversations that happened on those walks were different from the practical daily conversations of ranch work. She told him about Missouri in pieces, a farm that had been in her family for 2 generations, a mother who had learned to bake from her own mother, and had passed the knowledge down with the particular seriousness of someone who understood that certain kinds of knowledge are actually a form of love preserved. She told him about learning to make bread at the age of 9, standing on a step stool at the kitchen counter, her mother's hands guiding her wrists through the rhythm of kneading. She made this particular bread, Della said, on one of those evenings, looking west at the colors happening on the horizon. The recipe came from her mother, who got it from hers. It has honey and a little rosemary, and you have to let it rise twice. Most people rush the second rise. My mother said the second rise was where it learned to be patient. She was smiling slightly as she said it. Not the same smile as the kitchen moment, but related to it, the same country. Declan stored this information with extreme care. The smell of it, she continued after a pause, is the most home I have ever smelled. More than anything else. More than wood smoke or horses or anything. That bread. My mother made it every Saturday. He did not say anything. He understood that certain things do not require response, only witness. She lost the smile gradually as the evening finished and they walked back. By the time they reached the barn, it was gone and she was herself again, contained and practical, moving through the dark with the sureness of someone who has learned to navigate by her own interior compass. He went to bed that night and lay awake for an hour looking at the ceiling. He was in love with her. He had probably been in love with her since the flour sack recipe card, and the 4-second smile in the kitchen, and the cream warm smell that had filled the room like a declaration. He was recognizing it now with the clarity that comes when you have finished resisting something and it simply settles into place. The problem, as he identified it lying there in the dark, was multiple and serious. She had come here to work, not to be fallen in love with. She was clearly a person who had been through something she had survived only by being exceptionally tough and self-sufficient. And any move he made that could be read as expecting or requiring something of her emotionally was a move that risked destroying the safety of this place for her. He had, over the previous 3 months, watched her relax incrementally, watched the second coat of her dark past ease slightly off her shoulders, and he had no intention of doing anything that might make her pull it back on. But he was also 31 years old and had been alone for 2 years and had not wanted anything this clearly or this specifically in longer than he could accurately account for. He decided to do what he was best at. He decided to be patient. He decided that if there was a second rise required, then he would wait for it. What he also decided, with a practicality that was the truest expression of who he was that he would learn to make the bread. This decision arrived fully formed in the middle of the night with the complete logic of a man who expresses care through action. He could not give her back Missouri. He could not give her back her mother. He could not repair the years of difficulty that had brought her to this point. But he could put that smell in the air. He could create the specific small miracle of that 4-second smile, and he could do it regularly. And if it never became anything more than that, at least she would have had that. He obtained the recipe card through a coincidence that felt almost planned, though it was not. He had gone to the kitchen one Sunday morning for coffee while Della was at the Elko Sunday market with Price to collect the month's supplies. The recipe box was on the counter, and it had been left slightly open, something she never left. A small folded card had slipped partially out. He picked it up to put it back and saw the handwriting, the different handwriting, not Della's precise confident letters but something rounder and older, and at the top in faded ink was written the bread. He stood holding it for a long moment. He made a copy, letter for letter, in his own handwriting, in the small pocket notebook he used for cattle counts, and replaced the original card exactly as he had found it. He felt some guilt about this. He acknowledged the guilt and kept the copy. The first attempt at the bread happened 2 weeks later, on a Tuesday afternoon when Della had ridden out to the East Range to help assess the fall grazing situation. Declan sent the hands on a fence project to the north boundary and had the kitchen to himself. He had spent considerable time in the intervening 2 weeks doing something he had not done since boyhood, which was paying close, careful attention to bread baking through the only means available to him, which was watching Della when she baked other things and asking Price, who turned out to have a mother who had been an exceptional baker in Texas, sufficiently oblique questions about technique to get general guidance without revealing his actual project. The first attempt was a failure of a specific and educational kind. The crust was too thick and slightly wrong in texture, and the interior was denser than it should have been, and the honey he had used was different from the variety she apparently preferred. He had also, he suspected, not waited long enough on the second rise. He ate the evidence before Della returned. It was not bad exactly. It was just not right. He tried again the following week, adjusting the timing of the rises and acquiring a different variety of honey from a beekeeper in Battle Mountain, whose product he had been told by Price was of exceptional quality. He got the interior closer to right. The crust was still off. Week 3, he tried different ratios and finally achieved a crust with the right sound when he tapped it, a hollow note like a question answered. But the smell was not quite right yet either. There was something in the rosemary timing when you added it, how much, something he was still figuring out. It was during week 3's attempt that Della came home unexpectedly early, because the East Range assessment had gone more efficiently than anticipated, and she had walked into the kitchen at 4 in the morning, which was when he had started the process in order to have it finished before the household woke, and the flour sack had slipped, and there they were. She was standing in the doorway. He was on the kitchen floor. The recipe card was in his pocket with the corner just visible above the fabric, and she was looking at it with an expression that contained the entire history of everything she had kept private, opened up in a single unguarded moment that was terrible and necessary in equal measure. "You were making her bread," she said. "I was trying to," he said, and stayed on the floor because getting up felt like the wrong kind of motion. This required stillness. "I have been trying for 3 weeks. I cannot get the crust right." The silence that followed was of a kind he had no experience navigating. It was not hostile and it was not simple. It was the silence of someone assembling information that changes the shape of things. "Where did you get the recipe?" she asked. "I copied it," he said. "From the card in your box." "It had come partially out. I put it back, but I copied it first. I should have told you." "Yes," she said, "you should have." "I am sorry I did not." She walked into the kitchen. She did not take the chair at the table but stood near the counter, looking at what he had assembled there. The flour and the honey and the dried rosemary and the carefully measured wet cloth over the bowl where the dough was completing its second rise. She picked up the jar of honey and looked at it. "Set it down." "Why?" she asked. Her voice was very quiet. He looked at her from the floor. He was still holding the torn flour sack, and flour was on his hands and his forearms and probably his face, and he was aware that this was not the circumstances under which a man typically declares himself, but the circumstances were what they were. "Because you smiled," he said. "When you smell it, you smile. That particular smile. And I have not seen you smile enough, and I wanted to put that smell in the air, and it seemed like the right kind of thing to do when you cannot fix the actual things that hurt someone." The room was very still. Della set down the honey jar and looked at him for a long time. The lamplight made her eyes complicated and dark. "Get up off the floor," she said, finally. He got up. She went to the rising dough and lifted the cloth and inspected it with the professional eye of someone who knows exactly what she's looking at. "The second rise is ready," she said. "You were right about that. Your timing is better than I would have expected." She paused. "The rosemary needs to go in earlier. That is what you are missing with the smell. It needs to infuse into the dough during the first knead, not be added to the top." She turned and looked at him. "Show me what you have done," she said. He showed her. She corrected him in 3 places, her hands moving through the process with the memory of a body that has done something 10,000 times, and her voice was quiet, and she kept her eyes on the work, and neither of them said anything about what he had told her, but it was present in the room as surely as the smell that was beginning to develop as they worked, warm and honest and impossible to ignore. They put the loaf in the oven together. They sat at the kitchen table and waited for it in the hours before dawn, with the lamp between them and the whole dark desert holding the house in its enormous quiet hands. "My mother died 4 years ago," Della said at some point during that wait, still looking at the table. "Fever. She was the last of my family in Missouri. I came west 2 years before that with my husband, Henry. He died the following year, snake bite. It was very fast." Declan said nothing. He listened. "The 40 acres was something I was trying to build, something that was mine. The first truly mine thing I had had in years." She paused. "Losing the water rights was not just about the money, you understand that?" "Yes," he said. "I was very tired when I arrived here," she said. "More tired than anything to do with the body, I know." "I have been less tired," she said after a pause. "These months, here I have been less tired." He did not push it. He simply received it. The bread came out of the oven and the smell that filled the kitchen was right. Not almost right. Right, complete. The rosemary and the honey and the wheat and the warmth. Exactly the way it had been the first time he had watched her make it. Exactly the way he imagined. It had been in a Missouri kitchen when she was 9 years old, standing on a step stool with her mother's hands guiding her wrists. He watched her face. She was looking at the bread on the counter, and the smile came. The real one, the private one. The one that belonged to no one and nothing in the current moment, but to something deep and essential and preserved. And it lasted this time not 4 seconds, but long enough to become something she was aware of, something she let happen. And then she looked at him. They looked at each other in the lamplight, with the bread between them and the desert dark and vast outside, and everything said and unsaid, arranged in the room like furniture you have to navigate around, but can also learn to live with. "Thank you," she said, and her voice had a quality he had not heard in it before. It was not gratitude exactly. It was something more layered than gratitude, the particular tone of someone who has been seen in a way they had stopped expecting to be seen. He nodded. They ate bread at the kitchen table as the sky began to lighten outside the window, the very slow lightening that happens over the Nevada desert like the world is reconsidering its options. And they talked. They talked about nothing specific and everything significant, the way people do when a barrier has come down and they are feeling their way carefully through new territory, not rushing, not overcorrecting, just moving through it together with the kind of care you give to something that matters. The hands woke to the smell of bread and coffee at breakfast, and ate in the particular grateful silence of men who have been given something good without asking for it. And Price nodded 3 times, which Declan had learned was the maximum expression of his endorsement. The weeks after that were different. Not dramatically, not all at once, but differently paced and differently weighted, as if something had been renegotiated at a level below words. Declan made the bread every Saturday. He had learned it now well enough that he did not need guidance, though Della still occasionally appeared in the kitchen on Saturday mornings, and they made it together. And those mornings had a quality that neither of them named but both of them recognized, something warm and deliberate and increasingly necessary. He watched her laugh for the first time in August. One of the ranch hands, a young man named Obadiah who had joined the crew in July and was 19 and desperately earnest about everything, had attempted to shoe a horse that had very strong opinions about being shoed. And the sequence of events that followed was sufficiently comic that when Obadiah finally sat down in the dirt, with the expression of a man who has been thoroughly humiliated by a quarter horse, Della laughed. It was a real laugh, full and surprised, with nothing held back. Obadiah looked up from the dirt and grinned, too young and good-natured to be mortified. Declan was across the yard, and he stopped walking and just stood there for a moment with the sound of it moving through him like a bell. She found her laugh. That was how he thought of it afterward. She found the laugh she had misplaced and had apparently been looking for, and it came back to her in a dusty yard over a frustrated horse and a 19-year-old in the dirt. Things progress the way things progress when two people are both fundamentally cautious about the things that matter most. Slowly, with attention, like the second rise of the bread. In September, she told him about Henry. Not as an opening, not as an invitation, but as a completion of something, a thing that needed to be said now that other things had been said. Henry had been a good man, she said. Solid and honest and hard-working. She had cared for him. The grief of losing him to a snake bite 2 years after their marriage, out on the claim land while she was in town for supplies, had been a particular kind of devastation because it had been so random, so entirely outside any logic or fairness. A man alive in the morning and gone by afternoon over nothing more than a path that happened to cross a rattlesnake's resting place. After that, she had been genuinely alone, and the 40 acres had been her answer to that, her chosen form of survival, the thing she had poured the grief into. Declan told her about the 2 years since his father had died, about how the ranch that had been a shared thing, the product of his father's vision and his own labor, and a father-son dynamic that had been complicated and close and central to his understanding of his own identity, had become suddenly just his in a way that was nothing like the ownership he had imagined when he was young. About the loneliness that had settled in so thoroughly that he had eventually stopped fighting it and started treating it as a feature of the landscape rather than a problem to solve. They were on one of their evening walks when he said this, the sage all around them and the western sky doing its thing, and she stopped walking and looked at him. "Is that still true?" she asked. "Are you still treating it as a feature of the landscape?" He considered lying, not to deceive but to protect the careful distance they had maintained, but the question was direct, and she deserved a direct answer. "No," he said, "not anymore." She looked at him for a long moment with those creek water eyes, and then she said very quietly, "Good." They walked back to the ranch in the dark and did not speak, but she walked close enough that their hands brushed twice and neither of them moved away. He did not kiss her that night. He did not kiss her the following week either, though there were 2 or 3 moments when the air between them had the kind of charge that makes restraint feel almost physical. He was not being cowardly. He was being the same kind of patient he had been all along, the kind that respects the other person's pace, because they know their arrival at readiness matters more than their own. October arrived with the first real cold, the sharp teeth of Nevada autumn biting down into the mornings, the light going golden and low over the sage, and the ranch turned to the particular intense labor of fall preparation. Cattle sorted and counted, and the winter pasture rotation established, and supplies laid in with the seriousness of people who know what a bad Nevada winter can do to a ranch that is not adequately prepared. They worked side by side through all of it with a coordination that had become natural over the months, each knowing the other's capabilities and limitations and patterns, each adjusting to the other with the unconscious ease of people who have spent enough time in close proximity that their rhythms have synchronized. One evening in the second week of October, they were in the barn after dark, finishing the last of an equipment inventory that had run long. The barn was warm from the animals, lantern light making the whole space amber and close, and the cold outside pressing against the walls. They had finished the inventory and were putting things away, and Deller reached past him for a coil of rope on a high hook, and he steadied the stepladder she was on with his hand at her waist. And when she stepped down, she was very close and they were both entirely still. He looked at her. She looked at him. "I would very much like to kiss you," he said, because he was not a man for elaborate approaches, and this was the honest version of the thing. "Then do," she said. He kissed her carefully, the way you handle something valuable, but she put her hand at the side of his face and kissed him back in a way that made carefully somewhat irrelevant. And the barn was warm, and the lantern swung slightly in the draft from the door, and outside the Nevada cold was doing everything the Nevada cold does, and none of that was the point at all. The point was the kiss and the hand at his face, and the particular way she said his name against his mouth when they finally paused, not as a question and not as a declaration, but as a recognition, the way you say a word when you have been thinking it for a long time, and finally get to say it aloud. Things changed after that, as things do, with the good kind of irreversibility. The practical partnership deepened into something that involved more laughter and more late evenings with the lamp, and more bread on Saturday mornings that were no longer entirely about the bread, but were still, in a way, about the bread, about what it meant to know someone well enough to make the thing that makes them smile. November brought a situation that tested both of them in ways that the ordinary difficulties of ranch life had not. A man arrived at the Faro Ranch claiming to be a distant cousin of Declan's deceased father, and claiming that there had been a mistake in the deed transfer when Declan's father had died, and that he had rights to a portion of the northern pasture. His name was Gerald Birch, and he was smoothly spoken and had documents that looked official at first examination. And he had a companion with him who said nothing, and watched everything with the alert stillness of someone paid to notice problems before they happen. Declan's instinct, which was the instinct of a man who has dealt with land disputes before and knows that smooth-spoken men with helpful documents are frequently neither what they claim nor what they seem, was cold and immediate. He was courteous and gave them the hospitality of a meal and a night in the bunkhouse, and he sent Price to Elko the next morning with a letter to his attorney. Della, meanwhile, did what she did with threats of this type. She sat down with the ranch documents and the copy of the deed and the land records she had organized over the previous months, and she built, with the quiet intensity of someone who has learned to fight this kind of battle before and knows the terrain, a comprehensive picture of the legal standing. The documents Birch had presented were fraudulent. Not dramatically fraudulent, not the kind you catch immediately, but fraudulent in the specific technical way that requires careful comparison of dates and registration numbers with county records. And Della caught it because she had spent 4 years becoming more expert in land documentation than anyone in a position of power had ever wanted or intended her to be. When the attorney rode out 2 days later and examined her findings, he confirmed them in full. The documents had been fabricated, probably by someone with partial access to legitimate paperwork from the Territory Land Office, and the name Birch appeared nowhere in the actual Farrow family history or the estate records from Declan's father's death. Birch and his companion left the Farrow ranch with neither grace nor success, escorted to the gate by Price and 2 other hands with the particular economy of movement that communicated, without any need for explicit statement, that the welcome had definitively expired. After they left, Declan found Della at the kitchen table with the documents still spread before her, and there was something in her face that he had not seen before, a kind of fierce satisfaction that was distinct from ordinary relief. "You have done this before," he said, sitting down across from her. "Not successfully," she said, and the satisfaction dimmed slightly. "With my water rights, I found the problem too late. I did not have access to the right documents, and I did not know the right people, and the company had better lawyers than the county had time for." She looked at the papers. "This time I caught it early enough, and you have an attorney who responds when called. You saved the ranch," he said simply. "No," she said. "You built something worth saving. I just did the accounting." "Della." He waited until she looked at him. "That is not the same thing, and you know it." She held his gaze for a moment, accepting what he was giving her, which was credit properly assigned. And then she nodded once and began organizing the documents with the efficiency of someone putting a completed project away. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, and she turned her hand over and held his, and they sat like that for a while in the kitchen with the November wind hitting the walls outside and the lamp burning steady and warm between them. The winter that followed was not easy, because Nevada winters rarely were, but it was different from Declan's previous 2 winters, which had been endured alone in the specific way that solitude during a hard winter takes on an almost architectural weight. This winter had bred every Saturday and lamp-lit evenings, and a person across the table who could argue about water policy or cattle pricing, or the relative merits of different varieties of wheat, and who laughed when the situation called for it, and was quiet when the situation called for that, and who had a laugh that still did something particular to his chest when he heard it. Della, for her part, was discovering something that she had protected herself so thoroughly against expecting that its presence was still somewhat astonishing to her. Safety. Not the safety of secure borders or adequate provisions or a sound legal position on land rights, though all of those things mattered, and she was better at assessing them than most people. This was a different kind. The safety of being known by someone who had looked at the specific shape of her history and found it not a liability, but a characteristic of the person they had chosen to be near. She had not known how much she needed that until she had it. In February, during a 3-day blizzard that kept everyone indoors and made the world outside the windows disappear into a white that was more like a wall than weather, she and Declan spent the evenings at the kitchen table, and she told him things she had never told another living person. She told him about the version of the Missouri farm she was leaving out of the carefully edited account she had given before. Her father's drinking and its consequences. The years of her childhood that had been organized around managing his unpredictability. The tight-held competence she had developed not as a natural character trait, but as an adaptive strategy for surviving a home where the threat was always present and always unpredictable. Her mother's bread as the thing that stayed consistent. The smell and the warmth and the ritual of it as the reliable fixed point in a landscape that was otherwise uncertain. She told him that Henry had been a good man partly because he had been utterly unlike her father, steady and kind and not dangerous, and that she had loved him genuinely, but had also chosen him partly from relief, from the deep exhausted need to be somewhere safe from the things she had grown up in. She told him that the 40 acres had been her attempt to build something that was entirely her own creation, that did not depend on anyone else's stability or reliability. That was hers to maintain and hers to lose, and therefore nobody else's to threaten. She said all of this quietly, over 2 evenings, with the blizzard doing its work outside and the fire doing its work inside. And Declan listened with the quality of attention he had always given to things that mattered, the complete, uninterrupted, non-reactive kind that she had learned was his most fundamental form of respect. When she finished, he said, "Your mother gave you the bread because it was the steadiest thing she had to give." Della looked at him. "Yes," she said, and her voice was unsteady in a way she let be unsteady. "That is exactly what she did." She was crying quietly, not dramatically, the way people cry when they have said something true, and the truth is also a loss. He moved his chair around to her side of the table and put his arm around her, and she leaned into him. And the fire was warm and the blizzard was outside where it belonged, and the lamp was steady, and the kitchen smelled faintly of the bread they had made that Saturday. Spring came back to Nevada the way it always did, slow and then suddenly. The sage turning green and the sky losing its winter white and going back to the deep blue that felt almost too saturated to be real. The ranch emerged from winter with its inventory intact, and its herd healthy and its finances in better shape than the previous year, owing in part to the water rights that had been defended, in part to the accounting efficiencies that Della had identified and implemented, and in part to the general improvement in operational organization that happens when more than one capable person is running a thing. In March, Declan Farrow rode to Elko and came back with a small box from the jeweler that operated out of the back room of the general store and supplied the territory with the modest necessities of celebration and commitment. He did not make a formal occasion of it. He was not a man who made formal occasions of things. He made the bread on a Saturday morning, as he always did now, with the rosemary going in at exactly the right moment during the first need. And when the loaf came out of the oven, he set it on the counter, and the smell filled the kitchen and Della smiled. The private smile that was no longer private because she had let him see it so many times now that it had become something shared, hers still in origin, but theirs in the present. He set the small box next to the bread on the counter. She looked at the box. She looked at him. "This ranch needs you," he said, and then corrected himself because the truth was more specific than that. "I need you. I have needed you since April, and I was not going to say it until I was sure you were ready to hear it and not before." Della opened the box. The ring inside was simple, a narrow gold band with a small inset of turquoise, blue as the Nevada sky in the deep part of summer, the jeweler's one concession to ornament in an otherwise functional object. "I am not going to make you choose between this place and your independence," he said. "You built something out of nothing twice and you came here to work, not to belong to someone. I am asking you to let me belong to you too, as partners, equally." Della looked at the ring for a long time. "I have been afraid," she said, "of needing anyone for a very long time." "I know," he said. "I am less afraid than I was," she said. "I know that too." She looked up at him with those creek water eyes and the whole spring morning coming through the window behind him and the bread smell in the air between them. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Declan." They were married in June of 1883, on a Saturday, because it was a bread day and that seemed right. The ceremony was small, held at the Faro Ranch with the local circuit minister, and a gathering of people who mattered. Martha Gibbs from the general store and her husband, the attorney, several neighboring ranchers and the ranch hands, including Obadiah, who wore his best clothes and was visibly moved by the entire proceeding in the earnest way of a 19-year-old who has decided that love is excellent. Price nodded throughout the ceremony in a continuous, deeply approving way. Della wore a dress the color of sage in spring, altered from a good wool she had owned for years, and she carried a small bunch of desert flowers that Obadiah had collected that morning with great seriousness of purpose, and presented to her outside the barn with ceremony that almost made her laugh. Almost. Declan stood at the front with the Nevada summer all around them and watched her walk toward him across the yard, and felt something settle in his chest with the completeness of a thing that has been waiting a long time for its proper place. The years that followed were the years of a ranch running well in the hands of people who were genuinely suited to the work and to each other. The Faro Ranch expanded in 1885 when they purchased the neighboring Holt property, whose owners were retiring to California, adding the Eastern Range and its water rights to the Faro holdings in a transaction that made the ranch large enough to require 2 additional hands and brought the total operation to a scale that was genuinely prosperous, rather than merely surviving. Della ran the accounts and the water rights management and developed, over time, a local reputation as someone to consult on land documentation questions, which led to her providing informal assistance to several neighboring homesteaders dealing with the exact kind of acquisition pressure she had once faced herself. This was not a formal arrangement. It was simply what she did when people needed it, with the quiet efficiency of someone who has learned that the knowledge she acquired through loss is worth something when offered to others before they experience the same loss. Declan learned in 1884 that there was a small community of Shoshone families whose traditional movement through the northern part of the county had been increasingly compressed by ranch enclosures, and that the source of the water issue they were experiencing was in part connected to fencing decisions made by several ranchers to the north. He was not the cause of the problem, but he was a landowner in the region, and he had water resources that could be managed differently. He made arrangements, after lengthy and respectful conversation with the community's representatives, to ensure that the water access on the northeastern corner of the Faro property was available for the movement patterns that had existed before any of the enclosures, and he participated in a meeting of the county ranchers that resulted in a partial adjustment of the northern fencing situation. It was a limited resolution of an injustice, with roots far deeper than any county meeting could address, and he did not pretend otherwise. But it was something, and it was the right direction. And Della was beside him at that county meeting and spoke clearly about the legal history of land access agreements that had been made and subsequently ignored. And several people left that meeting with more information and more discomfort than they had arrived with. Change was slow in the territory, but it moved. Their first child was born in 1884, a son they named Thomas, after Declan's father with the H dropped in favor of simplicity. And the birth was attended by the experienced midwife from Elko, who arrived 2 days early, and was very glad she had, when Thomas decided to arrive in the middle of a rainstorm that made the road from town briefly impassable. Thomas came into the world with strong opinions and excellent lungs, and the particular determination of someone who has decided that arriving is worth the effort. And Declan held him in the kitchen at 4 in the morning while Della slept, and the rainstorm finished, and the desert went quiet and fresh outside. And he felt the specific weightlessness of a man who has been given more than he expected. In 1886, a daughter arrived, Frances, and she had her mother's eyes exactly. The creek water shade over dark stone, and she had her father's capacity for stillness that people would spend years mistaking for coldness before discovering was simply attention. Obadiah, who had stayed on at the Faro Ranch and grown into a reliable and thoughtful young man, was by that point engaged to the daughter of the Battle Mountain blacksmith, and he asked Declan and Della if he could host the small engagement supper at the ranch, which they agreed to with genuine pleasure. The supper was a considerable success, and Obadiah's intended, a direct and capable young woman named Harriet, was welcomed into the Faro Ranch social circle with the warmth that the place had accumulated over the years. In 1888, 5 years after the wedding, a third child was born, another son named James, and he had Declan's dark eyes and his grandmother's round handwriting if such a thing can be inherited, which is not possible but which James's eventual penmanship would seem to suggest anyway. The Saturday bread continued. It continued through all of it, through the years of growth and the occasional hard seasons and the expanding complexity of their lives, through Thomas's childhood and Frances's childhood and James's arrival. And it became one of the things the Faro Ranch children grew up knowing the way they knew the smell of the sage and the sound of the wind and the color of the Nevada sky. The bread was a Saturday thing, the kitchen filled with it. Their mother smiled at it. Thomas, at age 5, asked his father why they made the bread every Saturday. Declan considered this question with the seriousness it deserved. "Because your grandmother made it," he said. "Your mother's mother in Missouri, and when your mother smells it, she smiles the way she smiled when she was a girl learning to make it." Thomas considered this information. "Does it make you happy when she smiles?" "Yes," Declan said, "more than most things." Thomas nodded with the complete satisfaction of a 5-year-old who has received an answer that makes total logical sense. He went back to whatever he had been doing. Declan went back to the dough. On the 20th anniversary of Della's arrival at the Faro Ranch, a Tuesday in April, she stood in the kitchen in the morning with the window open and the spring smell of sage coming in. And she thought about the woman who had ridden through that gate 20 years ago with a broken lease and a saddlebag, and the particular exhaustion of having survived too many things in too short a time. She thought about what that woman had not expected to be seen, had not expected to be known. had not expected a man quiet enough to notice a 4-second smile and thoughtful enough to understand what it meant and patient enough to spend 3 weeks on a kitchen floor at 4 in the morning learning to put that smell in the air. She thought about the bread, about her mother, about the way certain kinds of love are passed forward through the things that carry them, the smell of honey and rosemary and wheat and warmth. The way a recipe card is not just a recipe card, but a letter from someone you loved to someone they loved, sent through time. Declan came into the kitchen behind her, and she heard him without turning, the particular footfall of a man she had memorized in every context and weather and mood. He stopped behind her, and she felt the warmth of him close. 20 years today, she said. Since you rode through the gate, he said. Best day I ever had on this ranch. You hired me to cook and keep accounts, she said, with the tone of someone who has told a joke so many times it has become a different kind of truth. I did, he said. And you did both excellently, and saved the ranch from a land fraud and taught me to bake bread, and agreed to marry me and raised 3 children on this property, and built something that is going to outlast both of us by a considerable measure. He paused. Fair wages and fair work, as I recall. She turned around. He was gray at the temples now, and the lines of his face had deepened with the years of sun and wind, and the particular weathering of a man who has spent his life outdoors. But his eyes were exactly the same, the dark, patient, noticing eyes that had watched her from across that kitchen table 20 years ago with a quality of attention she had not known how to receive yet. She put her hand on his face, the way she had in the barn the first time, and he looked at her the way he always had, like she was a fixed point, like she was his geography. Thank you, she said. The same words she had said in the lamplight the morning he had told her why he was making the bread. 20 years later, and the words were still the right ones because some things do not need improvement. For what exactly? He asked, with the warmth of a man who knows but wants to hear it. For paying attention, she said. For the bread. For staying on the floor until I told you to get up. For all of it, Declan. For all of it. He kissed her in the morning light with the window open, and the sage coming in and 20 years between them like something solid you could stand on. Later that Saturday, the 3 Pharaoh children came in from their various morning activities. Thomas, now 16 and already tall with his father's build. Frances at 14 with her mother's eyes and her own particular sharp humor. And James at 8, who arrived in the kitchen covered in some substance that was hopefully mud and was immediately redirected to the wash basin. Thomas went directly to the bread on the counter and cut himself a thick slice with the focused efficiency of a 16-year-old who has been smelling that bread since, before he could form memories of it, and has never once taken it for granted. Frances sat at the kitchen table and looked at her parents with the alert assessment of a 14-year-old who misses very little. You are both extremely pleased about something, she said. 20 years today, Della said, sitting down at the table. Frances considered this. Since you arrived here, since I arrived here. Frances nodded slowly, filing this information. Then she said, Papa made the bread. Papa always makes the bread, James said from the wash basin, where he was engaged in a serious negotiation with the mud situation. Because it makes Mama smile, Thomas said from where he was eating his slice with the particular combination of satisfaction and nonchalance that is unique to 16-year-olds consuming good food. Frances looked at her mother. Della was looking at Declan, who was looking back at her in the uncomplicated way of a man who has run out of reasons to protect the outward expression of the most important thing in his life. Frances observed this exchange with the full attention of a girl who is learning, from the primary example available to her, what it looks like when 2 people have built something real. She thought it looked like bread. She thought it looked like 20 years of Saturday mornings. She thought it looked like a man who learned the recipe because she smiled when she smelled it, and who never stopped making it, not once, in all the years that followed. Declan poured coffee for himself and for Della, and sat down at the table, and James arrived from the wash basin substantially cleaner, and took his place at the table with the absolute confidence of a child who has never known anything except a kitchen that smells like bread on Saturday mornings and parents who look at each other like that. Outside the Faro Ranch, the Nevada desert was doing what it had always done. The sage silver and green in the April light, the sky going its blue, the land wide and patient and indifferent in its enormity. Inside, the bread was warm and the coffee was ready and the family was present, and the lamp that had burned through so many early mornings was not needed now, because the light coming through the window was more than enough. Della looked at the bread on the counter, the smell of it in the room, the honey and the rosemary and the wheat and the warmth. Her mother's recipe, her grandmother's recipe, the thing that had been passed forward through every generation with the understanding that certain kinds of love require a vehicle, something to carry them through time, something with a smell that crosses 20 years and lands in a kitchen that is entirely different from the one it started in, and is somehow exactly the same. She smiled. The smile was private and full and completely hers, just as it had always been. And Declan saw it across the kitchen table, and felt the thing in his chest that he had first felt on an April morning when a woman he barely knew pulled a loaf from the oven and smiled at nothing visible, and changed the direction of his life without any intention of doing so. He had been paying attention for 20 years. He planned to pay attention for 20 more. Thomas cut a second slice of bread, and James immediately demanded parity, and Francis observed that both of them were being extremely obvious about it. And Declan poured more coffee, and Della passed the bread across the table, and the Nevada morning continued around them, bright and ordinary and completely irreplaceable, the way all the best mornings are.